Hi, everyone. In preparation for dissection checks, I wanted to make sure that everybody had access to a video where all of the different parts of the brain were both named and their functions given in a clear and concise manner. So I'm going to do that for both a cat brain, as shown here, and a human brain, which I'll do in a few minutes. So, first of all, this is the cerebrum, and this entire region would be protected by the cranium. The spinal cord, which would have been back here, would have been protected by vertebrae, and both the spinal cord and the entire brain would have been wrapped in meninges and protected with cerebrospinal fluid. Next, there are 5 regions of the cerebral cortex that you're required to know. First, up here is the prefrontal cortex. This is involved in functions such as planning, reasoning, focus, personality. Back here, we have in the frontal cortex, we have the motor cortex. The motor cortex is involved in skeletal muscle control. Behind that, at the front of the parietal lobe, is where you'd have the somatosensory cortex. This is where you perceive senses such as touch, temperature, and pain. On the sides over here, we've got the temporal cortex, and the temporal cortex is involved in senses such as audition or hearing and equilibrium, or what some people call balance. Um, Back here, we have the occipital cortex. The occipital cortex is involved in vision. So those are the 5 cortical locations of the cerebral cortex. The subcortical regions are not going to be required in the 2020 virtual dissection check. Next, we have 3 interior and 2 nerve tracts that you'll need to know about. I can't show them especially well in these images. The 3 directions I'll highlight though. The interior tracts that go anterior and posterior would be called association tracts. The ones that would go up and out in this kind of a direction would be called projection tracts. And then the tracts that go side to side, left and right, connecting the cerebral hemisphere are called commissures. But the only one that you need to specifically know about is this one right here, which is the corpus callosum. So, again, 3 tracts: association tracts going forward and backwards, the corpus callosum, which is a commissure going left and right, and then the projection fibers or projection tracts going up and out. There are 2 nerves that you need to be aware of. This one right here, sweeping from the nasal region back. These 2 are the olfactory nerves. These carry smell or olfactory information. These 2 nubs right here are the very ends of the optic nerves, which are for visual information. And because it's missing here, I'll just show it right now. This is where the pituitary gland would be. Okay, so we've covered 5 cerebral cortex locations, 3 interior tracts, 2 nerves. Next are 3 locations of the diencephalon. This region right here is the thalamus. And when sensory signals are coming up the brainstem, they end here and then are relayed from the thalamus out to specific locations of the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is for relaying sensory signals. Below that, we have the hypothalamus, and this works with its partner, the pituitary gland, which would have been right here. And the hypothalamus monitors body conditions and regulates them, and it orders the pituitary gland to release hormones when necessary to help it regulate body conditions and development. So, again, the hypothalamus monitors body conditions and controls them with the help of the pituitary gland, which releases hormones as ordered. Next, we have 3 regions of the brainstem, plus the cerebellum, and then the spinal cord. This region right here is the midbrain, which is involved in a variety of functions, including sleep regulation, satiety, meaning satisfaction, and a whole lot of reflexes that deal with vision. Back here, we have the pons, which is a singular word, and in addition to be where tracts cover through the brainstem, the pons is involved in reflexes associated with hearing, and is also involved in respiratory control. And you can also notice that this is what's attached to the cerebellum. So any tracts going to and from the cerebellum are going to go through the pons, which is why it's named the pons, which means bridge. Um, Back here, we have the medulla oblongata, or we'll just call it the medulla. The medulla is involved in reflexes that are further down the face. So remember, we had visual reflexes, auditory reflexes. Back here, this is where nerves go to and from the tongue and the pharynx. And so this is where you have coughing, gagging, vomiting, swallowing reflexes. Also, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are regulated here, as well as heart regulation. Back down here, we have the beginning of the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, as well as the brainstem, as you can see, is mostly white matter. And this is where we have ascending sensory signals going up this way. So tracks that carry sensory signals are going to go up the spinal cord and go through the brainstem. And descending motor signals to control your muscles are going to descend this way through the brainstem and through the spinal cord. So to review these regions, we have the midbrain, which is involved in visual reflexes, sleep, and a number of other functions. We have the pons, which is involved in respiratory control, auditory reflexes. Back here, we have the medulla, which is involved in reflexes such as coughing, gagging, vomiting, swallowing, etc., as well as sympathetic and nervous and parasympathetic nervous system control, and then the spinal cord, which, just like the rest of the brainstem, is involved in ascending sensory pathways and descending motor pathways. Lastly, back here we have the cerebellum, which is involved in motor coordination. So while the motor cortex, which is up here, wouldn't be involved in deciding on what kind of muscular movements you would want to make, the cerebellum is involved in timing and coordinating those movements for a smooth action. Now, if we're going to switch to a human brain, I'll just quickly run through all of those again very quickly. Okay, so we have the brain, which would have been covered in a cranium. The spinal cord, which would have been back here in this view, would have been protected by vertebrae. Meninges, as you can see on this side, but not on this side, would have protected all of those structures. And underneath the meninges and within them would have been the cerebrospinal fluid. Regions of the cerebral cortex that you need to know include prefrontal for planning, decision making, attention, personality, the motor cortex of the frontal lobe, which is right here, the motor cortex of the frontal lobe involved in skeletal muscle control, the somatosensory cortex right here of the parietal lobe involved in touch, temperature, and pain perception, the temporal lobe, which has auditory and equilibrium perception, and the occipital cortex, which is where you have vision perception. Next, we have three sets of tracts. We have the tracts that go from left to right in the brain. This would be the corpus callosum. We have the tracts that go up and out, and these would be our projection fibers. And then we have the tracts that go forward and backward, the association fibers. So forward and backwards, anterior and posteriorly within the same cerebral hemisphere. Next, we have two nerve paths. This is the olfactory pair of nerves, which are involved in smell or olfactory information. These two right here are the ends of the optic nerves for visual information. Three regions of the diencephalon, the thalamus for relaying sensory information, the hypothalamus for monitoring body conditions and regulating them with the help of what would have been the pituitary gland right here, which sends hormones to regulate body conditions. Three layers of the brainstem, the midbrain involved in visual reflexes, sleep, hunger, um, and a number of other emotional pathways. Here are the pons involved in respiratory control as well as auditory reflexes and tracks going to and from the cerebellum. The cerebellum, which is involved in timing and motor coordination, and the medulla, which is involved in reflexes such as coughing, gagging, swallowing, vomiting, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, as well as cardiovascular heart regulation. Down here, we would have the spinal cord, and just like the rest of the brainstem, it's mostly white matter where you have ascending sensory pathways and descending nervous pathways. Hope that helped. Feel free to rewatch, pause when necessary, mute, and practice on your own.